All right, thank you for joining us today, where we're going to talk about medical review of Mohs Micrographic surgery. My name is Mary Sue Gardner. I'm a registered nurse on the Provider Outreach and Education team, and I'm going to be your facilitator for today's event. And I'm also joined today by my friend and colleague, Jennifer, who's going to be helping out with the chat portion as well as the question and answer for today's event. So my overall objective for today is that you learn about the reviews for Mohs, specifically CPT 17311, and why the reviews are happening and what we're looking at. We're going to achieve this objective today by defining Mohs micrographic surgery. We're also going to talk about why we're doing these reviews. We're going to get into the coverage criteria as well as the documentation. So we've got a lot of stuff packed into this next hour. Again, just to draw your attention, since we are covering CPTs, please note that there is a disclaimer and a CPT disclaimer that I'm not going to read to you, but by agreeing to participate in today's event, you are also agreeing to our disclaimers. And those are located at the end of your slide deck. So this is one of those new things. Look for these little notes at, the bottom of any of our slides that may tell you, hey, I need to look in the notes section of this slide. All right, so let's start with talking about what Mohs surgery is. Mohs Micrographic Surgery, or MMS, is the acronym for it, and it's actually a technique for removal of complex or ill-defined skin cancer with histologic examination of 100% of the surgical margins. So this technique is generally used to treat two of the most common types of skin cancers, which are basal cell carcinoma and squamous cell carcinoma. So Mohs surgery is actually a two-step process, but the process is considered one occurrence. So two-step process, one occurrence. In this two-step process, the tumor is removed in stages, and that's followed by immediate histologic evaluation of the margins of that specimen. So further excision is then performed until all margins are cleared. So the physician performing MMS furnishes both the surgical and the pathological services. For example, the excision and the histologic evaluation of the actual specimen. So it requires the integration of individual functioning in actually two separate and distinct capacities. They're the surgeon and the pathologist. If either of these responsibilities is delegated to another physician or other qualified healthcare professional who reports the service separately, these codes should not be reported for Mohs then. The Mohs surgeon, in this case, removes the tumor tissue and maps and divides the tumor specimen into pieces, and each piece is embedded into an individual tissue block for examination. Mohs surgery is also a health tissue sparing procedure. So the nice part about this procedure is by using this blocking technique and this layered technique, blocking each tissue sample helps the physician know if they need to go deeper or wider with each of those additional cuts. So why are we reviewing? Well, now that we know what Mohs is, let's talk about why we're actually reviewing this. We also got some pre-submitted questions like, when is medical review of Mohs needed? So we're going to talk about this. But one thing to note is most people, most physicians, most providers is the word I was looking for, that perform this surgery will never be reviewed. It's only those outliers that we're reviewing. So let's move on and talk about this. CPT code 17311, that represents the first phase of Mohs micrographic surgery technique. And that includes, again, the tumor removal and the tissue specimen mapping. The MMS surgery requires the integration of one individual functioning in two separate and distinct capacities, like we had said before. They're both the surgeon and the pathologist. Now, we ran data. WPS, from that data, identified that in our J5 contract of work, so in J5, there were providers that were exceeding the national average of utilization of that CPT code 17311 in terms of units per provider. So the providers in this geographic area were billing more than when compared to the nation. There was not any cert errors or findings related to this. So they're another review entity by Medicare that could also look at things. But the cert contractor had not reviewed this service. This was only our data analysis. So again, the data analysis was performed and it identified numerous J5B providers above the targeted threshold of units per provider. We started reviews of the providers that were identified, and they started in September, and more came in October, in November, and some will actually start in November. Now, the unique thing about data analysis is sometimes we don't know why things are higher than the national average. We don't know the answer until we look at and do medical review. So the data analysis gives us the numbers, and it says, hey, this service is a service that you as a Medicare contractor pay and process, and it's going out your door in this area more than the rest of the nation. So we don't know why. In order to decide why, to determine if it's being done reasonable and necessary, and in accordance with coverage criteria, we have to actually look at some documentation. So then what we do is we go after and start looking at first those providers that pose the highest risk in the service, those providers that have the highest utilization of this CPT code. Now, we don't know if there's a higher prevalence of skin cancers in the J5 area as compared to the other parts of the nation. We don't know what's causing these aberrancies. We just need to know, we just know the numbers don't look right, and so we have to decide, are they being done right? Just because they look higher doesn't necessarily mean there's an issue, but we don't know that again until we do medical review. So that's a little bit of information about the data analysis and the background of why we get to what we got to in reviewing in our J5 Part B area. Now, that does not mean any other jurisdiction or part of Medicare providers are off the hook. What that does mean is right now we're not looking at you. But if we start doing these reviews, and we're very early in the review process, and we see that there are national issues, that it's spanning far beyond or has the potential to span far beyond just this little section of work, then those reviews could be spanned out. But right now they are not. Moving on. Our medical review staff utilizes the Mohs LCD to review this service. There's also a billing and coding article on Mohs, so a companion article that talks about the billing and coding of this service to make sure your claims conform to the correct billing requirements. I'm going to link up to the LCD and briefly show you some of the information that's contained. Now, again, if you have the slide deck, Anywhere that you see this underlined, these are linked right to that resource. So if my computer plays nice, and it looks like it's going to open right to the Mohs LCD. And if you use the drop-down under contractor, you can see that we're looking at the WPS LCD. You do not want to look at any other contractor's local coverage determination. But what if you didn't have this slide deck and you didn't have that quick link available? You could go, we're going to go all the way back out to cms.gov. So you know enough to know that all LCDs are housed on CMS's website. If you go to cms.gov and you click on Medicare and you go to coverage and you go to Medicare Coverage Database or MCD, you can simply type in the words Mohs. And then what you're going to want to do to make sure you get to our LCD is you're going to want to pick one of the J5 or J8 areas of work. So in J5, we have Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri. I'm going to pick Iowa and search, and you're going to see I have two options that first popped up, and these are both WPS. So click on that one, and it's going to take you right to where I directly linked you to. Now, some things let's discuss in this LCD. And I want to make sure that you're aware of, because if you perform this surgery, you should be reading and understand our local coverage determination. Now we're going to go, this presentation today has a lot of the local coverage determination, coverage criteria, et cetera, built into it, but I do want to direct you for your final coverage criteria. Please follow everything that's in the local coverage determination. So it starts off with coverage indications, limitations, and medical necessity, and it gives some background information about the service. And then it goes on to tell you about, physician limitations and requirement, and even appropriate settings, things that we're not going to quite get into today. And then it moves on to some indications of coverage. Now, we've said that, some of the coverage criteria includes, you have to have that qualifying physician. That physician's got to be acting in both roles, both services, but let's talk about some of the other things that are in here under the indications. There are areas that you need to define within your documentation for Mohs surgery, and that includes this area H, M, and L, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, and I actually have a picture on the slide deck for you to help you quickly identify those. So when you are doing a Mohs surgery on a patient, you have to tell us what area it is being done in. There are also some aggressive features for basal cell and squamous cell that you need to identify, as well as look down here into the basal cell carcinoma, and it'll tell you, other indications of aggressive pathology, listing the area, if there's any nodular pathology, etc. And I'm going through this quickly because, again, a lot of this we're going to cover as we move on. Same with the basal cell and other types of cancers. And then there's limitations. So there's always indications for coverage, but then there's limitations. What makes it not reasonable and necessary? So pay attention to those. And then as we scroll to the bottom of any local coverage determination, if there are billing and coding companion articles, then those are also linked at the bottom of the local coverage determination. So we do have a billing and coding companion article, and I do encourage you to go out and read this as well. Again, it gives some background information, and then it starts talking about the actual codes that are or are not covered Again, it's not appropriate if reported with the 59 modifier when another biopsy is done. These are some of your limitations to coverage that are not only discussed in the LCD, but are further discussed in the billing and coding. You have much more documentation requirements listed here with a little bit of additional information about what types of things should be contained within your documentation. Now, remember, these documentation requirements are not just for someone under medical review, but for everyone. If we expand that medical review out to additional providers in J5 or even into our J8 contract of work, you want to make sure that you're meeting all the documentation requirements and coverage indications. So if we review you, you're going to pass with flying colors. So then again, coding indications and CPT codes are listed down here, as well as any modifier information, and then a whole plethora as you scroll and scroll and scroll of information on diagnosis codes. So make sure you have a diagnosis code that is covered for this condition. Now I'm going to link back out to the slide deck, and we're going to proceed on. All right. So on this slide, let's talk about what our reviewers check for or look for. You know, once they put your documentation under the microscope, what are they looking for? So as we saw in the LCD, we need proof that the service is reasonable and necessary for this patient on this day of service. So we check for that proof of medical necessity by verifying a covered diagnosis, for one. We look for those covered indications. Remember that list of indications and anatomic locations that we looked at in the LCD. Those are the same things that we have to look for in review of your services. We also look to make sure that it's the appropriate surgery. So was it the type of lesion that could have been managed by a standard excision or destruction technique? We have to also look at the characteristics of the lesion, which include the location and the measurements. So when we talk about location, that's those areas that H, M, and L, which we're going to discuss here in a little bit. Okay, so I briefly showed you the LCD, but let's move on and talk about that coverage criteria that's contained within the LCD. So I alluded to this a few slides ago. Part of our review is to look for the covered anatomic locations of H, M, and L. So as you can see on this slide, area H is the mask area of the face. It also includes the genitalia, the hands, the feet, nail units, and the ankles. So in here, you can see area H is blue, and those are all the blue highlighted areas on this graph. L includes the trunk and extremities. So L is all the grayed out areas. M includes the cheeks, forehead, scalp, neck, jawline, and pretibial surfaces. So again, that's all the green stuff identified here. Remember, if location or measurements do not meet the requirements as outlined in this LCD, this may be a reason for denial of your services. So make sure that you are documenting the location and the measurements correctly, because that's one thing that we're going to look for. As we discussed briefly at the start of this presentation, but also listed here and listed in the covered indications in the LCD for Mohs surgery are these types of cancers. So mostly the basal cell and squamous cell are what we see in Mohs surgery. But there are also other indications that are listed and listed here on this slide. Again, these are the two most common, but I do encourage you to please go back to the LCD and that local coverage article and make sure that you are documenting the indications appropriately, and make sure you are checking that extensive list in the local coverage article of the diagnoses codes and make sure that it is being reported for a covered diagnosis as well. Different types of cancers have different aggressive features. So for basal cell carcinomas, this includes these features that are listed here, and they're also listed in the LCD. And I'm not going to go through these because they're listed in the local coverage article as well as on this slide. But these aggressive features are things that, again, we're going to look for. In the squamous cell carcinoma, there's even more aggressive features of squamous cell carcinomas that are listed here on the slide and also contained in the LCD. Remember, it's important to document these aggressive features as indicated. So Medicare does cover MMS for the indications in the anatomical locations that are listed in the LCD. One of the indications of coverage is actually listing those aggressive pathology of the lesions. So again, make sure you're going back, checking that, and that you are documenting appropriately. As we move on, we also must remember that just as there are indications to coverage that you must meet, there's also limitations to coverage. So for Mohs surgery, these limitations include things like if a physician performs an excision using Mohs technique, but does not personally provide the histologic evaluation of the specimen. The procedure code for Mohs included in the Associated Billing and Coding article then may not be used. You have to then use a standard excision code and choose one of those standard excision codes for that service. Medicare is aware that a biopsy of a skin lesion for which Mohs surgery is planned may be necessary in order for the physician to determine the exact nature of the lesion that's to be removed. So occasionally, that biopsy may be needed to be done on the same day that the Mohs surgery is planned. So in order to allow separate payment for a biopsy and pathology on the same day as the Mohs, the 59 modifier would need to be used. That would be the appropriate modifier. The 59 modifier is also appropriate when a separate skin lesion other than a lesion for which Mohs surgery is performed is biopsied on the same day that the Mohs is performed. Okay, and then procedures that exceed medical need are not reasonable and necessary, therefore not a Medicare covered service. Therefore, documentation from the pre-procedure, the E&M notes, and or post-procedure operative notes must address why the lesion will not be or was not managed by standard excision or destruction technique. And when it's applicable, why, you know, when utilized or referred to a plastic surgeon, procedures for like a complex repair, adjacent tissue transfer, or a rearrangement, or a flap, or graft codes are employed. We would need to know. The option for care, both the primary procedure options and the repair options, must be discussed with the patient and clearly noted in the pre-procedure documentation. And then if a prior biopsy of a site undergoing Mohs surgery has been previously performed within the last 60 days, the surgeon should make a reasonable effort to obtain those results rather than repeating the biopsy. So this usually happens in the case where another physician gets involved and they feel they need to do a Mohs procedure of a site that's just been done within the last 60 days. They would need to make every reasonable attempt to get a hold of that documentation of those prior results and see if there was anything left, with those final cuts. I see a question came in, and if a physician performs the Mohs debunking procedure, would it also be allowed to be billed if it was sent to pathology for a consult or second opinion? The physician did include the histological determination as well. Nicole, I am pretty sure this would be allowable to, if there needs to be an additional send-out pathology, as long as the immediate interpretation was done. As far as how that would be billed, I do not know that at this time, but it's something I can get some information from my other teammates after this call, and we can send it out to everyone involved. But again, for the Mohs part, that physician would need to do the due diligence of doing not only the surgical part, but the histological part to the best of that surgeon's ability till they get to the end of, that site and they have no more borders. And then again, if additional pathology needs to be sent out after that, then I will find out that additional information of how that is done. Okay. So now that we've discussed what we're reviewing, why we're reviewing Mohs, and the covered indications and limitations, let's move on to how you support all of this in your documentation. And I've really alluded a lot to this in the prior slides. We also received several pre-submitted questions on what's required for documentation. So let's go ahead and jump into that. In order to support your services as medically reasonable and necessary, when we review claims, there's certain components of documentation that help prove medical necessity on your end. So the documentation we're going to request includes relevant medical history, physical exam, any signed prior operative reports or current operative reports, if the operative report is done, pathology documentation to support the Mohs and the Mohs technique. We need to see the documentation that the same physician was not only the surgeon, but the pathologist at the time. And then the histology representing the first stage and subsequent stages. Besides the actual components of documentation, we also need the indications listed in these components. And that includes things like the characteristics of the lesion before the procedure. Include that location and the measurements before the procedure is performed. We need to also see why the lesion was not managed by standard excision or destruction technique when applicable. Why procedures for a complex repair or adjacent tissue repair or transfer, again, or rearrangement or flap or graft were employed. We would have to see those indications listed, why we needed to do that. Signature attestation statement, if applicable. We always need to have signatures and credentials. So one thing I always harp on about signatures and credentials, because we're in electronic state of life. So all of our electronic documentation. When you print your electronic documentation, make sure those signatures and credentials append with the service or append with the actual pieces of documentation. There were issues in the past, and I hope they no longer exist, but certain EMRs, when you printed them, the signatures all printed on a whole separate signature sheet, and they were not part of the actual documentation. So the actual documentation just said refer to signature sheet, and you could not, in good faith, line up what was on that signature sheet with where it belonged in the documentation. So if you have something like that, make sure that you are working with your software vendor, that they develop a fix for you. All right. Again, the ADN, if it was applicable, and then any other documentation that supports your requirements that were listed in the LCD. So let's finish the documentation section by discussing some tips for more effective documentation. Remember, if you provide this service, even if you're not under review, you should be looking at the documentation in your facility and make sure you're meeting all necessary components in case you ever do become part of a review. Anyway, some tips to help you with your documentation include if there is a surgical deficit created by the Mohs procedure itself, and it requires reconstruction. It should support the reconstruction was appropriate to prevent further capabilities and to restore physical appearance. So you need to make sure that you are telling us why additional surgery is needed. Your documentation should support what's on your bill. That seems like a no-brainer, but if it comes across on your bill, we've got to be able to find it in your documentation. So your 1 unit, your initial CPT code is for the first stage and includes up to 5 tissue blocks. And then you would use the appropriate add-on code for additional blocks or additional stages after the first 5. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And then incorrect coding, it's going to probably result in either a down code or a partial pay or even just a flat-out denial of services. So we're still in the early stages of review, but there's been a few review findings that we want to discuss in an effort to help you avoid these findings if you ever find yourself as part of a review or an audit of your service. The GBC01. So these are actual denial reason codes that you would see appended to your bill if you had a denial for this reason. So the GBC01 means that the documentation submitted does not support the medical necessity as listed in NCD or LCD. So remember, these are CMS issued denial reason codes. So if you get this denial for this service, it means you didn't meet the coverage criteria for Mohs as listed in the LCD because there's not an NCD. More specifically, though, the findings under this were actually for diagnoses that was not supported as a covered diagnosis in our LCD and LCA or local coverage article. So make sure, again, if you're going to provide this service, it's for one of those diagnoses codes that's listed as covered. The next is denial reason code GBB02. Now, this reason code is insufficient or incomplete documentation. So that's the CMS reason. So the main reason under this denial in medical review is that it was unclear how many blocks were placed for the lesion. So remember, we just said a couple slides ago, when you're billing for the 17315 for each additional tissue block after the first 5, in a single layer stage, your units billed and your documentation must match. So in Mohs surgery, the base code is the 17311 or the 17313. And this covers your first 5 blocks. Add-on code 17315 is then reported for every other block after the first 5 in a single stage. So the documentation must support the number of blocks. So, you know, you can support not only that initial code, but any add-on codes if they are indicated. And so again, the denials we received or made under this denial reason code listed here were because we did not have good documentation of exactly how many blocks to know if the add-on codes, if the first code was even appropriate. And then that is actually going to take us to the end of our formal presentation. Luckily, at this time, we do not have a lot of review denials happening. So the majority of the services that are being reviewed are found to be medically reasonable and necessary. So that, again, leads us to why so many Mohs procedures in the J5 area of work. And then again, we don't know, is it something that there just happens to be a higher prevalence of skin cancer in this area? Does, you know, is there something in the water? Is there something biological? Things that we don't know. And until we do medical review of those services to make sure they're being done appropriately, we don't know if the data, you know, is showing that there is a problem or there is not a problem. So right now, early on, our data is showing you guys as providers are doing things right. And you're doing things that are in accordance with Medicare standards. So that's great on you guys. I'm looking over at the chat and I don't see anything in the chat right now. And know that I am going to get back to everyone about that question that we had on the debulking the procedure and if it's sent out for pathology and how to appropriately get that on your bill. So I have taken note of that and I will get that out to everyone. But in the interest of time and to give you a few minutes back in your day, we're going to proceed and I'll pause again at the end and look and see if any additional questions have come in that we need to answer. As you plan for next year, CMS wants to remind you of the advantages of participating in Medicare. First of all, you're paid the full Medicare physician fee schedule allowed amount. If you're a non-participating provider, Medicare pays 5% less than the Medicare physician fee schedule allowed amount. Medicare pays you directly on an assignment related basis, and Medicare forwards claim information to Medigap, which is the Medicare supplemental cover insurance, if there's any. So by December 31st, we just want to remind everyone, all physicians, practitioners, suppliers, regardless of your Medicare participation status, you need to decide whether you're going to participate in Medicare for calendar year 2026. You don't need to do anything if you're already participating in Medicare and you want to continue your participation. However, if you're not currently participating and you don't want to participate any longer, then you do have some steps that you need to follow. And go ahead and use this link that's provided in this handout in your slide deck, and you can find more information on that. While we value your opinion, we actually want to hear your opinion. So we want to know how we did on this event. Jennifer just put the survey for this event in the chat, and it only takes a few minutes to complete. And CMS did lower the amount of questions, so that's good. And we want to give you the opportunity now to take it while the webinar is still in progress and you have, your time already carved out of your day. So it's your opportunity to tell us what additional education you would like in the future, besides telling us if you like this event and was it useful. So I do encourage you to please take our survey. And again, you have several different opportunities to take it. Jennifer put it in the chat. You can use that. When the webinar closes, you're going to see a page pop up that looks like this. It is going to take you to an external site. It's not spam, anything like that. It's just taking you directly to the survey. And if you're listening to this event as an encore, you're going to see a box like this in the description of the event, and there should be an eye with a circle around it up at the top of your screen. And you can use either of those to take our survey. All right, finally, if you think of any questions during this event, please email those questions to us at that email address that Jennifer provided earlier, and send them within the next week. Please don't send any PHI or PII. Remember, we don't have access to the claims processing system. So if you need to find out about a specific claim, you're going to have to, unfortunately, take those questions to customer service because we can't look those up. Remember to check the notes section of the slide deck for any additional information that we want you to know. So let me take one more look and see if any questions have come in, and not seeing any. On behalf of Jennifer and myself, as well as our medical review department, we want to thank you for your participation in today's event. This concludes our webinar, and you may now disconnect.